It's 7 o'clock. Shall we get started or hang on for a minute or two?
Just check with Gautam. He's adjusting his,
Yeah, I'm asking him. Ambassador?
Yeah, I think we should start because
Okay.
I can't seem to get it onto my laptop. So
It's okay, sir.
to do it over the phone.
Okay. All right. Dr. Singh, shall we start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening and a very warm welcome to the last PIC conversation of this year. Our distinguished guest today is Dr. Anoop Singh, who will speak on the challenges and prospects for the economy of the People's Republic of China. Our distinguished chairperson today is Ambassador Gautam Bambawale. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our event speaker and chair. Dr. Singh has served as member, 15th Finance Commission of India, a constitutional body to recommend tax sharing between the centre and the states for the period 2020-2025. He has recently been adjunct professor at the Georgetown University in the US. Prior to that, at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, he was the director of the Asia Pacific Department, director of the Western Hemisphere Department, and director of Special Operations. Mr. Singh holds degrees from the University of Bombay, Cambridge, and the London School of Economics. His additional work experience includes Special Advisor to the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. Welcome again, sir. Ambassador Gautam Bambawale was a member of the Indian Foreign Service from 1984 to 2018. He was India's ambassador to Bhutan, Pakistan, and China. Mr. Bambawale was stationed in Washington, D.C. between 2004 to 2007 during the Indo-US nuclear deal, which transformed ties between the two countries. He was India's first Consul General in Guangzhou, China, from 2007 until 2009. He was director of the Indian Cultural Center, Berlin, in the 90s. Ambassador Bambawale worked in the Prime Minister's office from 2002 until 2004. At the Ministry of External Affairs, he was Joint Secretary for East Asia from 2009 until 2014. Mr. Bambawale has dealt with China for 15 years of his 34-year diplomatic career. Ambassador Bambawale is currently Distinguished Professor, Faculty of Humanities and Social Science at the Symbiosis International University in Pune. He is also Senior Advisor, Ola, Cab Aggregator. Dr. Anoop Singh, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Before we move on to the lecture, a couple of brief housekeeping announcements, please. We request our audience to kindly keep their microphones and videos switched off for the duration of this event. Please do not record the proceedings privately. We invite questions from the audience via chat box or direct messaging, and we will ensure that they are addressed to the extent possible during the Q&A following the lecture. Thank you very much for your patience. And now, without any further ado, let me call upon Ambassador Gautam Bambawale to address the audience and to welcome our speaker. Over to you, sir.
Dr. Anoop Singh, a very warm welcome to you. I hope you can hear me. The interest in China, of course, in India and all over the world has been great because of the rise of China over the past few decades. But since the summer of this year, after China has embarked on some military coercion tactics and attempts on India's northern border, the interest in China and everything she does has multiplied humongously. Everyone wants to know the answer. Why is China doing what she's doing? What are her calculations, etc. But I think it's also very important to look inward into how China's economy is performing, which is what you are going to speak about. We're all ears. I do not want to go on long on this. I would prefer to ask you some questions at the end of your talk before handing it over to the others. So, Dr. Anoop Singh, I think I'm going to hand the floor to you and request you to deliver your address. Thank you so much.
Very happy to be here and to do this. I presume you can hear me all right. So I'm going to talk about three issues. Hopefully they are interlinked. The first is the nature of China's recovery from COVID. Of that issue, new numbers came out from China this morning, 12 hours ago, on the last quarter in November. The second is, what is the fifth plenum and the emerging 14 5-year plan say about where China wants to be in the next 5 to 15 years? It's importantly linked in many ways to the nature of the recovery now taking place. And the third is, we can't avoid talking about the emerging trade agreements, be it RCEP or others, and the implication both for China and in that case also for India. So Gautam, you know China, I'm sure, much better than I do. I will try to be simple in my arguments, perhaps much more simple than China warrants. China is a very complex economy, as we all know. But let's start with the nature of its emerging recovery. Well, I think we all know what the numbers are. The new numbers came out 12 hours ago. It shows that growth in November continued to be beyond expectations as it has been for the last 3 or 4 months. The latest number from some observers is quarterly growth in the last quarter of this year compared to last year will probably be close to 5.9 or 6%. What that means is that for the year as a whole, China is almost the only economy with positive growth. The IMF some weeks ago had projected that growth for China to be around 1.9%. Many now are saying, after the data came out this morning, that it will be above 2. The number 2, if that is with a growth rate of 2.1, as some are saying, is important for reasons I'll come back to a bit later. Now, the issue is what is the nature of the recovery and what are the implications? Let me start with the exports, because I think we all look at their exports as an important indicator. Although the share of exports in GDP and in growth has declined significantly over the past 10 years. So let's look, basically exports, China's exports, the last 3, 4, 5 months have exceeded expectations from all observers. Now, we may argue, well, how is this taking place? So I think industry has recovered very fast. China's apparent success in controlling the pandemic domestically, indeed, industrial value-added growth picked up sharply after the first quarter and has now come back to pre-COVID levels. It's important to note that there are a number of counterforces to China's relying on exports. The first, from a policy point of view, is China's renminbi, the currency, has been appreciating significantly over the last few years, which has clear implications for China's exports. China's share of trade in goods, as I mentioned earlier, has significantly come down. It's probably half of where it used to be in 2008, around 30% of GDP. So what I'm saying is, although we focus on exports, what is driving the recovery is probably the traditional China response, which is it's focused on public investment, ensuring a swift reopening of factories, largely credit-fueled infrastructure and real estate investment. In contrast, direct support to household incomes has been quite limited, especially compared to other major economies. And so, although in many traditional areas, China's supply capacity is back to normal, so to speak, there are risks associated with this recovery continuing the way it is because it remains unbalanced. So what I mean is that China's uneven recovery this year from the virus, focusing more on investment and less on consumption, and focusing on debt-fueled investment, this is unlikely to be the driver of China's growth over the next 10 or 15 years because it will exacerbate already high financial risks. So my main point is that China's response this year has followed its growth model, which we know about. We've all talked about the need for China to rebalance, to restructure its fiscal framework, to reduce the propensity to save, and to raise the propensity to consume on the part of China's households. That's where we are. And now, what is the fifth pillar in final plan say about all this? Let me now move on to the text of the Communist Party's proposals. They have mapped out a blueprint for the next 15 years. It's important just now to look at the four objectives. They start out by saying that by 2020, they have basically eliminated absolute poverty in China, especially in the countryside. 2% is an important number for them because if the growth in 2020 is less than 2%, they will not double real GDP compared to 2010, as has been their objective. But I think they are coming close to growth this year being above 2, which means they will probably reach their objective of having doubled real GDP over the last 10 years. But they have now put forward 3 or 4 central objectives. So while many of us are looking at the recovery from the coronavirus in the next few months, China has detailed a pretty expansive look for the next 15 and 20 years. So what does China want to do? They say they want to become a high-income country by 2025. That is one important goal, which is the end of the 14 five-year plan. It means that they will need to reach a growth threshold, GDP threshold, of about 12,500 US dollars. So let's assume it's somewhere around 10,000 now. They then have set a set of medium-term goals by 2035. So they say by 2035, China needs to become what they call a moderately developed nation, which implies a per capita growth of 20,000 US dollars. And then it says by the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, which is 2049, China will become a fully developed, rich, and powerful nation. These are important because although China is saying that they are now going to emphasize the quality of growth over the speed of growth, they've been saying for a long time that they are not going to be driven by the growth target. It is also clear that their objectives for becoming either a high-income country, a moderately developed nation, or a fully developed nation depends on GDP per capita reaching certain levels. And therefore, implicitly, we have to question whether their focus on quality of growth is going to be superior to ensuring the rate of growth. I see that because in order to reach its objective by 2035, it's only going to happen if the annual growth rate is around 4.7 to 5% average per year. So we don't understand how exactly they are going to trade off the quality from the extent of growth. Now, the second most important aspect or takeaways from the blueprint is an important one. At its core is a concept called dual circulation. Now, dual circulation is simply a strategy of increased reliance on domestic demand, domestic supply chains, and domestic technology. There isn't a comprehensive or precise definition of what this means, but this is their core strategic policy factor. Now, this is important because what does this mean? Does it mean they're going to reduce their reliance on external opening? It implies they will. It implies that they're going to focus, as economists have been saying for the last 15 years, we've been saying across the world, China needs to rebalance, needs to shift from credit finance investment, which is basically public investment, which is basically investment by state into consumption, and broadening the focus of investment to the private sector. So isn't that what China means? So if China's dual circulation really means rebalancing the economy in this way, it's a response to what we've all been saying for a long time, which is they need to rebalance. But let's look a little bit more closely on this. I think what is fundamental in their dual circulation is the focus on innovation and scientific and technological and building up innovation investment domestically. What does this mean? I think this is the most important factor from my point of view about what was said of the 14 plenum conclusions. We know that the country already spends about more than 2% of GDP on research and development, and they've set a target of 2.5% of GDP must be spent on research and development. This is the second largest amount globally, country by country, if viewed at in absolute terms. However, it's important to recognize where China is. Although in some areas of technology, such as fintech, e-commerce, solar and wind energy, and electronic vehicles, Chinese companies are already at the cutting edge. However, China recognizes that they have been more into applied research and applied innovation rather than fundamental research. And this is at the heart of the debate between the US and China. China wants to move from being the leader in applied research, it wants to become a leader in foundational technology, which means it will be above the United States in what is called technically foundational technology. And I think that is what the focus of the 14th five-year plan is. I don't think they mean they're going to reduce their external interventions. That will continue. A small point, they might possibly reduce and restructure the nature of their investment and interventions in what we call the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. They are recognizing that that is not producing the results that they had in mind. And so I think in the dual circulation, the issue is moving investment from state enterprises to institutions that will become leaders in foundational technology, not applied technology, and China wants to become a leader in that over the next 15 years as fundamental in its desire to becoming a fully developed nation by 2035. So that is my view. Uh, we can talk a lot more about the 14 cyber plan try to say, but I don't think we need to go over it now. They recognize that they need to change the structure of the fiscal economy. They recognize the need for making consumption the driver of growth. They recognize the need for having much better social security. They recognize the need for uh, increasing the propensity to consume of households. They recognize the need for raising the share of consumption services. To a large extent, that is already taking place. So I think all that is understood, all that is applaudable, all that is responsive to the rebalancing that we want to see. But I think the most important is the nature of the shift is to get to technology, away from being a leader in adopting and applying technology, becoming a leader in foundational technology. So, in certain areas, they are the leader in the foundation of technology. That is my second point. Now, I'm trying to stick to my 30 minutes. So, let me now go on to the third part, and that is the nature of the emerging trade agreements. They are linked in some ways. Now, we all know that there is an RCEP. It has come into operation. Uh, it brings together about 30% of global GDP. In terms of global trade, these 15 countries, which, as you know, comprise of the 10 countries of ASEAN and obviously China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So they comprise a total of about 27, 28% of global trade. So that number is important. It's a large number. Now, if we were to compare this to what happened to President Obama's TPP, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, had certain other goals. The TPP wanted to focus on services, finance, e-commerce, investment, and technology, and wanted to set new rules in these important areas of future global growth, so that if there isn't a WTO working on this should be set by the US and the G7 more than by China. Now, obviously, the US dropped out of the TPP, as we know, but all the remaining 11 countries have formed the CPTPP. So that is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So why do I focus on these two things? Because it comes right back to the role of India. And what does India do? Now, it's important to recognize that the RCEP, the RCEP, is therefore quite different from what had been intended in the TPP. It's also quite different from the CPTP. For example, in terms of its tariff reduction and structural reforms, it is much lighter than the TPP, and also in terms of tariff reduction, much lighter than the CPTP. There's one very important factor. This RCEP, or RCEP as some call it, will create common rules of origin for the whole bloc. What that means is that one country of origin certificate will be sufficient to ship goods tariff-free across the membership of RCEP. Therefore, it brings down transaction costs. So the issue is, if you want to cater to the market of the RCEP, you can be anywhere in these 15 countries, and that is why a likely winner is going to be Vietnam. So for India and the US and for Europe, if we want to have a similar advantage in transactional costs and in tariffs for the 15 countries in RCEP, production must be based within the region. Anywhere is fine. And you have the ability then to transport and export anywhere in the region without any extra cost. Now, the RCEP is far away. It has basically not gone into policies and rules and opening of the digital economy for e-commerce, retail, finance, and payment services. So you might argue a lot of the future growth parameters for India have not been sufficiently developed in terms of rules. And that may be good or bad, depending how you want to see it. What I'm trying to say is two things. One is it's very difficult to make the case from a simple point of view that if countries have not joined the RCEP, such as India or the United States, it's difficult to argue this is net positive because any country that is not in it, if you want to get a trade advantages of supply chains producing and exporting within, you need to have a production in the region. So it's difficult to make the case how India or other countries benefit by staying out of it. But then I'm trying to go on to another proposal. What should India do now? I don't think India is going to change its mind and go back into RCEP tomorrow. But what should India do, given that its interest is in services, finance, technology, and those areas that are not sufficiently in RCEP, were in TPP, not sufficiently in CPTPP. Now, the emerging understanding is that the new administration in the US is not going to propose, let's re-engineer TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It can't just go back to that. What it might try to do is to get other countries involved. Remember that Korea is not a member of CPTPP. Some thinking is emerging that the new US administration may want to now negotiate how the US could join the CPTP, this 11-country group that was formed because TPP could not be formed. And if they want to do this, they will want to deepen the coverage of industrial policy, of state-owned enterprises, which is what China does not like, data protection and safeguard, but also on services and finance. So the thinking is that the areas that are not in CPTPP and not in RCEP is where India's interest is. I believe that in the United States could very well look to India to become a partner in a revised CPTPP. Now, you could argue why is that good? India is not ready to meet the standards even of RCEP in terms of production, tariff, and so on. But there is thinking going around that countries like India and Vietnam have got this in RCEP. There could be a transition period of over 20 years for some commodities. So the issue for the India and the US is looking at these trade agreements. You've got the RCEP for Asia, and you've got the CPTPP. Both do not include the US or India. The US was supposed to be part of the TPP, it's not the CPTPP. The new Secretary of State in the US I believe is the person who developed the term pivot to Asia under the Obama administration. So if it turns out that the US will turn slowly to how to become a member of a trade agreement in Asia, it's not going to be the RCEP, it's going to be the CPTPP. And therefore, there could be interest for India to be part of that process too. So I'm trying to say that we are not in RCEP. That's where things are. Nothing is to be gained by saying this is a self goal, which many believe it is. We have to look for the future. And looking at what China sees as its strengths, as India sees as its strengths, it is possible that India needs to be in a larger trade agreement with the US and parts of Asia and Korea, focusing on issues where rules will be developed by the group. It's not as good as the WTO, but that's where the world is. So I'm saying there are options coming in the next 1 or 2 years on trade that India needs to be deeply aware of. So those are my 3 points on the nature of the recovery, on the 14th five-year plan and the fifth plenum. What is the nature of China's focus on core circulation, domestic circulation, and then this all links up in many ways to trade. Finally, it is difficult to argue that growth can be what everyone wants it to be without trade being more open. If it's not going to be multilateral and WTO, these multilateral trade agreements certainly are some help. So those are my points on those 3 points. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anoop Singh, for a wonderful, wonderful and well delivered remark. A lot of not about China's internal economic situation and where she wants to go with 5 and then even beyond 15 years. But also some great suggestions from you on possibilities for India to consider in the coming years, maybe in the next years, on trade agreement. So thank you very much for a lovely, lovely address, which has provided us much food for thought. I'm going to use my prerogative to ask you one question about the political economy of China, and which is that over the past 40 years of reform and opening in China, one of the causes, one of the reasons for their economic success was the devolution of economic decision making, the decentralization of economic decision making down the line. But under the current leadership of Xi Jinping, there is a clear decentralization of power and decentralization of economic decision making. One example is how party apparatchiks have been put into private sector industry, as a result of which you had this IPO fiasco for Ant Financial. So, in your opinion, is this re-centralization economic power and decision making in China, which we have seen over the last 5 or 6 years, is likely to continue under current leadership? Is that good for the Chinese economy, or is it not so good for the Chinese economy?
Okay, that's a very important point. I didn't go into that point. Let me make 2 points on that. First, where is the world economy now? Not just China, but everybody. If you go back into history, even 100 years, the Great Depression, whenever there are these crises that we are facing now in the pandemic, which may be a health crisis, in these crises, there tends to be a centralization of power in most countries. So because of COVID, we can expect the centralization of decision-making and policies in a number of countries for some time to come. That's where the world is now. The second point is what you said, China, as usual, was ahead of COVID. China has been centralizing its decision making every year more unexpectedly, more significantly, and more dominantly than even people in China have expected. So the centralization that is taking place in China under President Xi is confounding even domestic expectations. So what you say is a fact. And the issue, therefore, is a very tight balance in how they get into their technology focus domestically, because they recognize, on the one hand, that research so far has been done more by the state owned sector. It needs to shift to outside the state owned sector. How do you do this if you have this centralization of policies? So there is a clear uh, tightrope. And even in China, it's they're unable to explain how we can become a technological powerhouse in foundational technology while keeping it completely within a centrally controlled economy. Okay.
That's an excellent response. Think that was brilliant. I think I'll hand the floor to Shilpa. Shilpa, I believe there are a few questions from our audience, and
Yes,
I guess I should hand the floor to you for those questions and let that.
sure. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Singh. Thank you, Ambassador Bambawale. Following that very interesting and very engaging lecture, we have a few questions coming from the audience. And Dr. Singh, with your permission, I'll just read them out. The first one, will India's strategic intent to completely reduce our imports from China have any impact on China at all? A related question, is there a viable comparison between the Indian and the Chinese economies? And then a third one, will there be political stability if the debt balloon cannot be serviced by the export-import growth?
All right. Thank you.
Maybe I'll request you to address these, and then while we get more questions in or have further discussion on your responses. Thank you.
Okay. Your first question was about imports. And your
The
question
reduction
is,
of dependence on Chinese goods.
you're saying, is this having an effect on China?
Yes, that's the question.
Well, Chinese exports currently are booming at a rate that we've not seen for some time. So if you look at China's exports, whether it is to ASEAN, to Europe, or the United States, it is exceeding expectation across the board. So China's exports are one of the leaders of their recovery from COVID right now. So China's exports don't show any obviously. Let me make one point on that regard. Again, I don't want to comment on Indian policies, but you know that in the United States, Trump's one of his major objectives has been to reduce the US trade deficit with China and to reduce imports from China. If you look at the data in the last 3-4 years, what does the data show? The data shows that the US deficit with China, after all these intentions, trade wars, and policies of the US, has reached high levels in many months not seen before. The result has been, in fact, a much higher, sustained, and continuing US trade deficit to China. Now, your second point was about debt, or was something else? Your second question, Shilpa?
The second question was to request you to compare, how do you compare the Indian and the Chinese economies?
Well, that is difficult to answer. I'm sure everyone in this room will know it better than I do. The simple answer is, over the last 10 or 15 years, trade and exports have been an important driver of China's growth. That is not the case with India. Number two, like Japan did 30, 40 years ago, China is doing now, and that is making research, applied research, and technology a focus of growth, transformation, and development. China's investment in research is the second highest in the world. That's not the case in India. So I think we have to look both at the role of trade as a part of growth, and more fundamentally, whether domestic or foreign, we have to raise the pressure on research being done. Now, research can be applied, research can be foundational, research can be simply adapting what you import. China has moved from importing and improving technology, which was its gambit for many years, into becoming now the leader in new foundational technology. It's a big shift that we are seeing. Your third question was about debt. Is that on China's debt?
Yes, it was.
Well, I think that is the mystery. Because virtually every economist, it shows why economists are usually wrong, but virtually every economist, including who's in the press a lot, Ken Rogoff, who was the IMF's chief economist and now is a very important professor in Harvard, many economists, including Rogoff and others, had predicted that China would have a debt crisis by 2014 and 15 and 16. It has not happened, despite every economic variable suggestive of bank and corporate debt, which is unsustainable. If you put Japan aside, Japan has high debt, but in Japan is very straightforward. All this debt is held domestically. Where China is concerned, its ability to avoid a crisis is quite incredible. It fully recognizes this. I would argue one thing. Between 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13, the deputy governor of the People's Bank of China was Yi Gang. Yi Gang was openly known globally for talking quite openly and straightforwardly about China's risks from debt-financed growth and its implication for debt, and the risks that debt becomes a crisis. Yi Gang was a major speaker on this regard. It's interesting that he has become the governor of the People's Bank of China. I raise that because I think there is deep understanding domestically that they have to reduce the burden of debt. It all depends on the nature of growth and the stimulus. They need to shift away from making growth dependent on credit finance investment in state-owned enterprises and open up the financial system, move away from a bank-centered financial system into a multi-plank financial system, and make sure that debt goes to new productive industries, not to the old state-owned enterprises. I think there is recognition of this. It is partly why they're focusing on quality of growth and not the speed of growth, but it remains a question mark even till today if China can avoid a debt crisis. But clearly, the odds in favor of that have really been reduced over the last 4 or 5 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a few more questions coming in. So if it's okay, I'd like to read them out. There's some interesting questions and we would really like to hear from you. Thank you. So the next series of questions are from Soumya Roy, Mumbai-based journalist. Could you please talk more a bit about attracting export manufacturing from China to India? As China looks more at spurring domestic consumption, will India be able to attract manufacturing from the US to here? And also, do you see more defense economic cooperation between the US and India?
Right. Well, I think we've all been hoping for that. And no doubt it is happening to some regard, and it will happen. Because as you look at India's role over the next 20, 25, 30 years, the domestic consumption and the growth is going to be immense. It should be what China has gone through in the last 20 years. So if you're looking ahead 20, 25, 30 years, it should happen. But in the meanwhile, I would argue it is not likely to happen in the next few years, because under RCEP, the advantage for investors who are already in China is to shift to other countries in the RCEP area, because there are very significant price-related advantages for remaining in RCEP. And that is why we see Vietnam as, in some smaller way, the next China of this group. It will need a lot more in terms of policies, which we all know about, financial, labor, land, etc. that India needs to do to attract sufficient investment from China.
Okay. Maybe one last question, if that's okay. I've just had, one moment. 1 minute. The question was here and it's gone now. I'll just, okay, here we go. Can we compare the Chinese economy and the Hong Kong economy? Which one is more pro-people?
Which one is more for people? Is that
pro-people?
Pro-people. I think the fundamental answer is that Hong Kong is part of China. And there can be little doubt about that. Hong Kong has been the financial center of China for all these years. In the next 10 years, you will see competing centers in southern China that will probably rise to the same level as Hong Kong. China will have multiple financial centers beyond Hong Kong. So I think Hong Kong's advantages, especially on the financial side, are going to be in some ways taken over by other centers in China over the next 10 and 20 years.
Shilpa, if I could just jump in and ask Dr. Anoop Singh, Anoop, if I could ask you a slightly provocative question.
Sure, and we have Dr. Kerkar who would also like to ask a question.
Sure.
So,
slightly provocative question, Anoop. As you rightly pointed out, India has kept out of RCEP or RCEP or RCEP. But my slightly provocative question to you is this the time for India to do an FTA with Taiwan?
I lost that. Can you repeat that?
So is this the time for India to do an FTA with Taiwan?
My simple answer is that in a world where multilateral opening is not happening and the WTO is not functional right now, any trade agreement is probably worth it, and Taiwan will give advantages in access to other countries that will help. My simple answer is we need to be open in trade agreements. almost all the trade agreements are prepared to give you a long number of years as a transition time. But staying out of trade agreement, I think, is not a recipe for sustained growth. Okay. Vijay.
Yeah. Now, Anoop, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Let me first thank you for your very thoughtful presentation. In PIC, there are some of us are right now looking at China, trying to understand China, and some of us are also looking at what are the China's possible vulnerabilities. I mean, there are vulnerabilities like we are quite aware of our own, but we're trying to understand the Chinese vulnerabilities because then only we can sort of think about appropriate sort of policies vis-a-vis China. So some of us are feeling that it is possible to think that China, one important vulnerability is going to come in about the framework of 10 years, 15 years, is the demographic implications of one-child policy. Its policy because its impact on supply of labor, or more supply of aging and supply of health costs and other welfare costs. Now, I know at IMF you would have studied this intensively. So I would be very grateful for your remarks or your reactions. Do you consider this as a potential vulnerability of China?
Yes. I think that's a very good point which I talked about. And that is, China is beginning to face the problem of aging. And in order to retain its growth at levels that it wants to, it has to address the issue. And I will say the aging issue, China is now moving to the second or next generation where it's losing the demographic difference it's had so far, and it is now having to deal with aging as a major obstacle for growth. This actually is recognized in the 14th plenum. It is recognized in the 5-year plan, as we will see it in a few months. There are clear strategies to deal with the implications of aging, and they are seeing symmetry, commonality between focusing on technology and becoming a leader in technology as giving them a growth driver that will take over from the demographic dividend that they've had so far. So I think the implications of aging are becoming very important for China. And I didn't say this earlier, but it is also going to be a fundamental component of the 5-year plan, how to deal with the aging issue. It's a very good point, and we need to look at that very carefully. India is not there yet, but the issue of how do you use a demographic dividend, and then what do you do when you India will in about 30 years, China is facing it now, and what have other countries done? So I think this aging issue is becoming very important as a driver of the growth outlook for China in the next 20 years. Yes, you are right about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. So let me now go back to Ambassador Bambawale for some final concluding remarks before the vote of thanks. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anoop Singh, for addressing the Pune International Center on this very important issue of China, China's economy, and also free trade agreements in the region. I think your address has been very, very illuminating. We have learned a lot from it. And I think one of the major takeaways which I have is your suggestion that India could consider, now that it is not a signatory to the RCEP, though that is still open to us, but one of your important points was that India should consider becoming a member of the TPP, the 11-member TPP. That's an excellent recommendation, a great suggestion from you. I'm sure we will analyze that. I hope that the government of India and other parts of the government of India also analyze it. But thank you very much, Dr. Anoop Singh, for this. It's been a privilege to be able to listen to your views. And let me conclude my remarks and hand over to Shilpa for closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Singh. Thank you very much for such an enlightening conversation and for a most timely one. It's been an evening of much learning and takeaways, and I want to first thank our distinguished guests, Dr. Singh and Ambassador Bambawale, for engaging with us. I'm sure all our participants will agree that this discussion has touched upon many pressing issues, even more so in the context of the constraints imposed by the pandemic. On behalf of PIC, thank you very much once again. I want to thank our PIC colleagues for their tremendous efforts. You are behind the scenes and on call all the time, which makes events like these possible. Thank you very much indeed. And last but certainly not the least, many thanks to all members of the audience for enthusiastic participation. We hope you and many others will join future PIC events as well. Do stay tuned for updates on our website and social media pages. Dr. Singh, Ambassador Bambawale, we look forward to hosting you again. And with that, we now conclude this evening's PIC conversation. Good night, Shubharatri.